Everyday Samurai, Episode 45. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How are you? Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Recently, Dr. Edwin Vieira, a noted constitutional scholar, penned an article regarding how the COVID-19 response, and by that more specifically we mean the policy responses of the various bureaucracies and politicians, has revealed three distinct discontinuities of government. And I was fortunate enough to get a chance to talk with him about it in detail. I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of it, as well as what to do about these discontinuities. So we'll get into that in just a moment. But before we do, it's important to make the most of this lockdown to better yourself, to come out the other side of it improved in some way, as well as find some meaningful method of passing the time and develop your skills while you're at it. Obviously, as warriors on the dual path of scholarly and martial arts, we continue training, continue studying, with a focus on fitness, health, well-being, mental, physical, and even spiritual fortitude, yet also developing new skills, developing new ways to stimulate the brain and increase our personal capacity. To that end, I suggest diving into learning that foreign language you've always wanted. Of course, I'm partial to Japanese, yet this too is another opportunity for you to exercise choice. And more personal choice is what is needed in an era where so much of what we would choose to do has been artificially limited. That's why I recommend Rocket Languages. They've got you covered for pretty much any language that you want to learn, and they make it fun and accessible. And best of all, if you go through my link, you can get a free 2-week trial to the language of your choice. So check it out at everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket. Okay, let's join the conversation with Dr. Edwin Vieira. Dr. Edwin Vieira, welcome back to Everyday Samurai.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
You wrote a very intriguing article entitled COVID-19 and the Three Discontinuities of Government, which leads to the question, how has COVID-19 revealed the way technocracy negates America's Republican form of government?
First, you have to understand what technocracy is. You have to distinguish between technology, which is a body of knowledge, subordinate to science, right? Science gives you the basic principles. Technology tells you how to mechanistically apply them. And then technocracy is a concept of political control. It's rulership, if you will, political control by a technocratic elite, people who are supposedly well-versed in certain of the areas of technology. And we have that as a particular example in the COVID-19 situation. You have the people coming out of the CDC, actually CDCP is what it's called, CDC, the FDA, some of the other agencies, Fauci, Birx, and so forth, who are more or less telling President Trump, what to do, what policies to follow. So you ask yourself, well, who's really in control there? Is it President Trump? Well, no, because he's following, let's not call them the dictates, but the directives of these scientists who supposedly know what the score is. Now, the difficulty then becomes a political one, and a legal one, relating back to the concept of a Republican form of government. The Republican form of government is one in which the people are sovereign, and the concept is sovereign people delegate certain powers to their government, so-called just powers. And then the government exercises these powers, and if the government fails to do that, then some kind of change is warranted. By whom? Well, by the people, because the people have the ultimate power in the first place. In fact, the very concept that the people delegate powers to a governmental institution is, on its face, the proof that the people themselves are the ultimate government. They had to have those powers in order to be able to delegate them. You can't delegate something you don't have, certainly not in terms of legal context. So when you have technocracy, you have a group of people, now in administrative agencies, the way the government of Washington operates, and state governments as well on a smaller scale. And these people are essentially saying, look, you folks out in the hoi polloi, you folks out in the masses, among the masses, you can't understand what we know. You have to follow our directives, guidelines, rules, regulations, whatever it is we put forward when one of these emergency situations, take that as an example, one of these emergency situations arises, such as the COVID-19 panic. And that includes not only you average Americans, but your representatives, people in the House of Representatives, people in the Senate, people in the White House, President Trump. Now, if you look at that claim, you say, well, how does that square with the concept of representative government? How can the people delegate to other people in government, these experts, powers which the people themselves don't understand? How can the people consent, as the Declaration of Independence says, the consent of the governed is the standard. How can the people consent to delegate authority to a governmental institution, and specifically to these technologically oriented bureaucrats, when the people are incapable of understanding the subject matter? On the face of it, it's an absurdity. So the claim of the technocracy, the claim of these supposed experts in bureaucracy, is a direct contradiction of the concept of Republican form of government. So it can be one way or it can be the other. You can have a Republican form of government, which is a basic principle of the Constitution. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union Republican form of government, Article 4, Section 4. You can have the consent of the people as the basis of a delegation of authority to governmental institutions, which is the Declaration of Independence, and so those two are obviously directly related. Or you can have technocracy. You can have bureaucrats who claim to have superior knowledge based on science or whatever they're using as the rubric, and that excludes the possibility, logically, of consent of the governed, because the governed cannot consent to something they don't understand, and it excludes the possibility of a Republican form of government, or shall I say, it takes the place of a Republican form of government. And it sets up this elitist form of government based on people with superior knowledge, supposed superior knowledge.
Is it accurate to call this the deep state?
Well, I think the deep state has a lot more than this, because the deep state includes, obviously, the so-called intelligence agencies, there's 17 of those, who knows what they do. Then you have, we're seeing now, the Department of Justice and the FBI. And the deep state concept is that certain parts of the government are working against the constitutional structure. This is subterranean sedition, if you will. And General Flynn is the example of that, I suppose. The real problem there was they were working to get President Trump. I mean, they wanted to turn General Flynn. Maybe he would say something, he would admit to something that they could use against President Trump, or the next best thing would, they'd get him for some crime, and that would then in some way impact the Trump administration by saying, well, look, you people had this crook in there from the very beginning. You're obviously not capable of running the country. So that's the deep state. I don't think the technocrats are necessarily working in the same way that cabal in the FBI and the Department of Justice were working. They probably have no conception that what they're doing is contrary to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or anything else. They have this elitist idea that they have superior knowledge, and that with superior knowledge, they have some sort of divine right. Well, it's not called divine right of kings, divine right of whatever they are. Scientists, I guess some of them would say they are, to direct society.
From their ivory towers.
Yeah, Rexford Guy Tugwell, way back in the 1930s, who wrote the New States Constitution, was one of these people. This actually goes back to the turn of the 20th century. This whole concept of administrative agencies was established on the premise that the average Joe is incapable of being a citizen in a democracy. Because democracy, in theory at least, presumes that there are people who are educated enough so that their votes mean something. And when you have masses of only semi-educated individuals, what do their votes mean as a practical matter in running a complex society? In fact, they'll probably foul it up. So the idea was administrative agencies would be set up composed of experts in each field. Some of them would be scientific, some of them would be, so let's say, economic experts, Security and Exchange Commission, we were talking about that earlier. Obviously, these agencies dealing with public health have a scientific or scientistic claim to them. And the people's role in this would be to elect pliant representatives, and the representatives would then create the appropriate agencies and fund them, increasing the funding, of course, each year, and give them more and more power. So the agencies would be able to direct the course of social evolution, if you will, based upon scientific and technological principles. And that would be the best thing for everybody, because now the smart people would really be in control, and everybody would be happy, because the average Joe would be going to elections every couple of years, and he would be thinking that he had some operative play in this system, and so would the people in the legislature, right, because they still could claim the power that they could pass statutes or amend statutes or whatever. And so there'd be this game being played at the two lower levels, in Congress and at the level of the electorate. But at the top level of the pyramid, there'd be the all-seeing eye, and the all-seeing eye would be controlled by these unelected bureaucrats who essentially had permanent tenure until they were ready to retire. Fauci's the example. How long has he been there?
Since 1984.
Yeah, decades. Same man. And nobody ever looked into his background. Nobody ever looked into the mistakes he's made. Nobody ever looked into his connection with the Gates Foundation. I mean, nobody ever looked into this. Well, sure they did, but nobody paid any attention to it, number one. And on the other hand, it was difficult to lever somebody like that out. You know, it's like a big old stump in the middle of your yard. How do you get that thing up?
Yeah, it's bureaucratic entrenchment.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And he obviously made the right connections, networked, and so forth and so on. So he has people protecting him. And in every administration, he was ensconced there, and nobody, if they had wanted to, I don't think anybody ever tried to remove him, but it would have been a difficult situation in any event. So here we have it now. Here's this fellow who is, and interestingly enough, he changed, talk about a scientist, he changed his position 3 and 4 times on this COVID-19 business. Right? At first he was saying there was nothing to it, and then he was saying he had to lock down the whole world, et cetera, going back and forth. So you look at that and you say, well, how really scientific is this? Scientists are not supposed to make panicky predictions before they have sufficient amounts of evidence. So I just wonder, looking at his performance over the last 4 or 5 months, I just wonder the extent to which you can really say he has a scientific mentality or this was political. But in any event, that was the structure. That's the structure we have now. And the difficulty, and this is the discontinuities of government, that's the underlying discontinuity of government is administrative agencies. And in the COVID-19 situation, it's the administrative agencies directly in the public health field. And it's true at the federal level in Washington, and it's true in, I won't say all of, but certainly many of the states, the larger states that have deeply entrenched public health bureaucracies. Same type of situation. Who's giving Cuomo advice in New York? Who's giving Northam advice in Virginia? Who's giving Gavin Newsom advice in California? Well, it's his public health agencies, made up of the same kind of bureaucrats, and of course they're talking to the people in Washington, so it's kind of a monologue going on here. Right. And then all the people who are dissonant voices, they're shut down by the media if they're not castigated and demonized or whatever.
Well, there's also an international superstructure of influence through the WHO, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties in directly. Well, the question becomes who actually runs that. From the funding, it looks like the U.S., the U.K., and the Gates Foundation are in control of that. They follow the money. Who's paying whom? Usually the person who pays the piper calls the tune.
Well, that's the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules.
So it's pretty much a UK, US, and actually US because the UK follows the US. UK is a satellite of the US. And Gates, what is Gates? Well, he's a front man for a bunch of medical elitists. So it's this tight little group, and Fauci is right there in with them right at the upper level. That's your number one discontinuity of government, and the COVID-19 thing has shown that in the most blatant fashion possible. You could pick up a lot of other agencies as examples, the SEC in terms of the way it operates with the markets, the National Labor Relations Board in terms of the way it operates with unions in the private sector. Look at a lot of these other agencies, and you'll see the same mentality and that same basic problem. But this one now has demonstrated the power to control every aspect of everyone's life. You can be told to stay in your house and not come out. Well, that's house arrest. Think about that. That's house arrest. I don't think that the Hitlerites did that.
I mean, the fascists realized that they needed productive workers and productive processes in place to fund the big nationalist welfare state.
They never made even that claim that they could simply, that Hitler said, he never made the claim, I can put every German in his house and you're not allowed to come out. Mussolini never made that claim. I mean, you run down the so-called fascist government. Mussolini was the only really fascist government, as a technical term. But you look at all those authoritarian governments in Europe between World War I and the end of World War II, and you don't see anything like this. This is unprecedented in the real sense of unprecedented. 1984 didn't go this far. It didn't tell Winston Smith that he could never leave his little rat hole he lived in. Just said he had to stand up in front of the telescreen every day. But that's what they'll be doing to you pretty soon as they get the chip in you.
Well, this might be a good time then to simply ask, I mean, does the mere existence of the 27 agencies comprising the National Institutes of Health signify an anti-constitutional establishment? What about the other administrative, executive agencies and bureaucracies?
Well, that's where you run into a problem because there are so many of them, and there has been now such a accretion of powers over the years that should say on the surface, well, they're all bad. At this level, delegation, it's abdication. They usually talk about Congress delegating powers to various agencies. It's abdication because once Congress gives them these powers, Congress never gets any control, and it never returns the powers to Congress and never gains real control over the exercise of those powers by the agencies. So I would say you'd probably have to look at each one of them and ask the question, is it possible that we could reduce this thing to a level at which you could actually claim that it was performing a valid constitutional function for Congress? And I think that would be very, very difficult, especially if you look at the very first one, which was the Department of Agriculture, basically. I mean, you can go back and talk about the War Department even, right, and the Army and the Navy, standing army, and how basically that's contradictory of the constitutional principle.
I mean, if I go back into my history, as far as I know, there were only three executive agencies right up until around 1853. The War Department, State Department, and the Department of the Interior.
That's right. Well, there was a treasury. But the word treasury actually appears in the Constitution. You could imagine the treasury being a shoebox that the president kept money in. So you say, oh, well, obviously the president can't do that. He has too many things to do. So we'll set up this thing with accountants and so forth and so on. And so there is that word. There is a treasury of the United States. All these other things were created kind of out of whole cloth. Well, the president has the authority to deal with foreign powers, make alliances, treaties, so forth, have discussions, send ambassadors abroad. And that logically leads to the concept of a State Department. And the State Department is there to do what? To help the president perform his functions, not to tell the president what to do or not to act independently of the president. And then you think of the Department of Justice. Well, the president has the constitutional duty to take care of the laws be faithfully executed. That's his most important constitutional function because that subsumes everything within the power of the executive branch. And to execute that function, I suppose you could imagine the president could do it all alone. He would be the investigative agency. He would be the prosecutor that goes to the grand jury. He would be the prosecutor that prosecuted people in court. You could imagine that happening, but as practical matter, it couldn't. So they set up a thing called the Department of Justice, which will be staffed with lawyers, at least, who will help the president in performing those functions, subject to his ultimate control, not as an independent entity. It can't possibly be independent. It exists solely for the purpose of assisting the president in performing that function. To the extent that it starts acting outside of that role, it's unconstitutional. Think of the Department of Defense. Right? Well, you have armies and navies. Well, you're going to have a space army, I guess, as well. Armies and navies. Air Force, that's an air army. And so you have a department, which used to be called the War Department, and the Department of the Navy, because they only had an army and a navy. Now we have the Department of Defense, which spends most of its time working out wars of aggression. But you can imagine the Department of Defense, what's it there to do? It's there to assist the president, who is what? Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, subject, of course, to Congress's enacting rules and regulations for the governance of the armed forces. And so we have a Department of Defense that will assist the president in performing his function as commander-in-chief, subject to the statutes passed by Congress, which the president has the duty to take care be faithfully executed. This isn't complicated. You don't have to go to Harvard Law School to understand this. Just read the document. So you start looking at those original agencies and maybe some of the others. It is conceivable because Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. So maybe it could set up an interstate commerce commission, which would be there to assist the president in executing the laws relating to the regulation of interstate commerce by Congress. Now, those laws would be few and far between, not the great mass of laws they pass. But you could imagine a commission that would be set up for that purpose. All right, so look at the various powers of the post office, another one, okay, kind of a classic example there. So there are specific powers of Congress that could lead to the creation of so-called agencies, but they would be agencies of whom? They'd be agencies of the president, really. Congress would have to pass specific statutes, and then those agencies, if those agencies were interpreting those statutes, it would be subject to control of the president directly. All right? The agencies wouldn't have independent authority. As soon as they start talking about independence, they're talking unconstitutionally. It's inconceivable to have independence, but there they are.
Or legal deference, as we were talking about earlier,
yeah,
where the judges are deferring to these executive agencies' decisions because they have expertise, supposedly.
Well, these agencies, many of them are what's called administrative agencies. They kind of lie in between because they claim to have quasi-legislative powers. They're taking a broad mandate from Congress, might be 3 sentences long, and they're writing 500 pages in the Federal Register of regulations. Now, where do those regulations come from? Well, they're made up by the agency, but they have the effect of law. Now, maybe the agency does not have quasi-judicial power. NLRB, for instance, has a quasi-judicial power. And cases come before the NLRB, and they have administrative law judges, and these things go up to the board itself, and they make decisions, and they have a whole set of NLRB reports, which look like judicial decisions, but they relate solely to labor management relations. And then those things can be appealed to the real courts.
And for the listeners who might not be familiar, it's the National Labor Relations Board that we're referring to by NLRB.
The National Labor Relations Board, okay? And that came about through what? Congressional regulation of interstate commerce in labor management relations. Now, the difficulty with that is labor management relations generally don't involve interstate operations, right? They're talking about a plant in Ohio or something, right? You don't have, in a sense, contracts at least the time when that statute was passed. National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935. Now, maybe you do because you got airlines and so forth where the contracts might involve workers in different states, et cetera. So you can even look at something like that and say, well, that's an interstate commerce agency based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. But why do they have the ability to write regulations? Why do they have the right to or the power, let's not talk about the right, why do they have the power to act as a quasi-judicial agency, hearing cases and controversies dealing with labor relations? And then, of course, when those cases and controversies get out of the NLRB and go to the circuit courts of appeals, which is a normal step, then the circuit courts of appeals start exercising this deference doctrine. And they say, well, we're not going to, if they had any reasonable basis for coming to the conclusion they did, we're going to have to accept that. What? Where's the oversight? Right? Congress gave this agency some authority under a particular statute. Who's going to exercise oversight over that? And so there's a difficulty. Some of these agencies claim not to be part of the executive branch at all. They claim to be under the legislative branch, even though they're exercising legislative, quasi-legislative, quasi-executive, and quasi-judicial powers. It's a real rat's nest of confusion. And so the thing has gotten out of hand. So the judiciary doesn't want to control it. Well, sometimes they claim they can't control it. Congress, as a practical matter, can't control it, even if it wanted to. And some of these agencies claim not to be within the executive branch, so the president can't control them. Now, there are only three branches of government. All right? And you'll see the courts especially calling these agencies the fourth branch of government. And then there's one case, I can't remember the name of it, I think it's Stewart, says, well, these agencies, the Founding Fathers would never have foreseen this. Well, if they would never have foreseen it, they didn't put it in the Constitution, did they? What they foresaw, they put in the Constitution, right? That's a rhetorical question. If they didn't foresee it, they couldn't have put it in the Constitution. If it isn't in the Constitution, how does it exist today? And this was a Supreme Court opinion. There was one with Scalia. I mean, Scalia talks about it. I can't remember, he waxes eloquent about this fourth branch of government.
And there's no constitutional authority for it.
But there couldn't be. You look at the document and you ask yourself, all right, here's the legislative branch, Article 1. Here's the executive branch, Article 2. Here's the judicial branch, Article 3. And that's where it ends. And then there's Article 4 and Article 5, of course, is the amendment provision. Article 4 is a kind of a catch-all for different types of situations. But Article 4 doesn't relate to the creation of administrative agencies. There is no fourth branch of government. But in any event, okay, so here we are. This is a discontinuity we see right away. COVID-19, with the public health services coming out of the woodwork to assert this anti-republican, anti-constitutional authority. And at every level, by the way, because Fauci is doing it at the national level, and then you have these state public health bureaucracies following his lead to a large extent. So he's coming right down into the state level and right down to the local level. And in those areas where the state bureaucracies are taking a slightly different tack, then they're controlling everything from the state capitals on down to, Main Street, USA. And you see a lot of those people in the states, Michigan, I think Nevada is an example, New York is a classic example, where the real dictatorial tendencies of these state governors and state bureaucrats have come to the fore. Now they're in their glory with this thing because everyone's so terrified of the virus that they're willing to kowtow to whatever comes out of the public health bureaucracies and the governor's offices. So they've shown us this discontinuity of government now because, of course, that's an impossibility. This level of tyranny, my goodness. None of this was charged against George III in the Declaration of Independence. You imagine what the Declaration of Independence would look like today if the Founding Fathers were here. And then, of course, you have another problem, the discontinuity with respect to checks and balances. The whole structure, well, let me go back one step. The second discontinuity, actually the first discontinuity I talked about in the paper that I wrote, was the possibility of military involvement, crisis occurring or somebody claiming it's a crisis, and the continuity of government doctrine comes into play. And what that really amounts to is that the military people, in conjunction to a certain extent with Congress and the executive branch, primarily the executive branch and the military people, they've set up plans for maintaining a continuity of government if there are serious breakdowns in the present civilian government. And that came out originally if there were nuclear war, right, and then Washington is struck or whatever, what's going to happen, who would take over, who would be able to run the country if there was a country left. And so same thing now. What happens if you have a pandemic like the Black Death, right? 30-40% of the people in the country die. And so the civilian government becomes totally chaotic because the chain of command or the chain of control is lost. Then who's going to take over? And the idea is the military is going to take over. Now, I don't know who believes that in that kind of circumstance, the military's chain of command is not going to be any more disrupted than the civilian chain of command. But there we have it. And of course, that's directly contrary to the Declaration of Independence, right? Because what was one of the things they castigated George III for? Putting the military ahead of the civilian lawmakers or executives, essentially martial law, the concept of military takeover. And his example was, I guess, the big example was General Gage in Boston, right, at the time. So that's right there in the Declaration of Independence, right, this concept that George III was violating the basic laws of nature and of nature's God, the whole principle of the introduction of the Declaration of Independence, because he affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. And these continuity of government theories assume that the military will be independent and superior to the civil power because the civil power won't be there anymore or won't be functioning at a higher level. So the military has to step in and take over. So you look at that and you say, oh, that COVID-19 is the thing that's causing them to now raise this publicly. They've been doing this for a long time. Most people don't realize it. But now they're very public with it. They've come out of the closet. And it's just this, it's a pandemic. Oh, we're going to have a pandemic, therefore the military will take over. Oh, I understand. Of course, you look at the military. I mean, these guys have been waging a war in Afghanistan for, 13, 14 years, and they haven't been able to succeed there. In Iraq, the same situation. They haven't been able to succeed there. Everything they've done in the Middle East has gone to hell in a handbasket. And these people are going to run this country economically, politically, socially, culturally, etc. If you have a pandemic that wipes out millions of people or wipes out a sufficient number of people that the various civilian governments can't function anymore, they have to be kidding.
Well, I can tell you from my own personal experience that it's even more alarming because I've been in the room with senior leaders at the highest level of the military that have come back from these overseas campaigns with a counterinsurgency mentality, and population control is the name of the game. They want to do biometric collection on everybody that attends any type of government function. They want to start having mass surveillance. They want to create this panopticon, and they're doing it in the Middle East, and they're doing it in Africa. I know this personally, and it gives me a chill up my spine when you hear a general officer talk about, hey, what about population controls? What are we doing about that with this training that we're giving, this foreign aid? They're bringing it here now. The empire is coming home.
Yeah, well, that brings you back to the Declaration of Independence, right? George III, he effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. If you put all those things into effect that you're talking about, and many which you haven't mentioned, that would certainly make the military independent and superior to the civil power. And that was considered to be so bad that it was a justification for separation. Let's not even call it revolution, because I don't know if it was revolution. It was separation, violation of the laws of nature. And nature's gone, okay. So where we have that, that's the second continuity of government. That's kind of hiding in the shadows. That's waiting for its opportunity to come to the fore. But they're there. And it was interesting the other day, a few days ago, I read that Trump was promoting something that he called warp speed vaccine development. I guess we'll all be on the Starship Enterprise when we get the shots, right? And this was going to be done in conjunction with the military. He was very clear on that. And he said he was in charge of it, and there was his admiral and the general, and they were also in charge of it, but he was the man who was really in charge of it. Good luck. I thought to myself, what's that going to do? The military, the Army and the Navy, they have big labs for producing vaccines. I never heard of that. No, it's the enforcement of the vaccination policy. All right? You have mandatory vaccinations for tens of millions of people, even if not everyone is included. I have all the school children and any people that have interstate transportation or whatever, certain jobs. All right? So you're talking tens of millions, maybe 100 million, 150 million people you're going to force to have vaccinations. Who's going to put that through? Who's going to execute that program? It's probably not going to be your local doctors and nurses because they can't force people to come into the clinics. So who's it going to be? Well, look what happens when you go into the armed forces. What do they shoot you full of now? 17 different vaccinations?
Oh, yeah. And I would never have had a flu shot in my life had it not been for my military service. I mean, it's mandatory now that you have to get that flu shot, and it doesn't stop the flu.
Right. And a lot of other things, which no one knows the long-term effects of. It's fascinating. But that's the mentality. That's the way they think about their own people, and therefore they're certainly not going to give any more latitude to mere civilians if they're told by General so-and-so that we, the military people, are going to enforce this vaccination mandate. So there's the second one lurking in the background, because of course you have the Faucis of the world, Dr. Birx, and many of these other people, a lot of these state governors, and certainly Bill Gates. How many degrees does he have in epidemiology and virology and so forth?
He doesn't have a degree at all.
Well, I thought he might have maybe 200 or 300 of them the way he talks. But there he is, and there they are, promoting this mandatory vaccination program. I mean, he comes out and says, this problem that we have now in terms of lockdowns and all sorts of other restrictions will not end until everyone is vaccinated. And I've heard Fauci make the same kind of statement. Well, there you go. So that's what they're telling you. You're living in this dystopia. You're living in a situation where the Republican form of government, which the Constitution guarantees, has been suspended, where we are on the verge of the military acting independently of and superior to the civil power. And this will not end until Bill Gates has been satisfied that everyone has gotten the vaccines that Bill Gates thinks we should have, which of course will never end because other things will develop. It won't just be COVID-19. It'll be COVID 20, 21, 22, whatever they are, because these coronaviruses, for one thing, mutate so fast they can't get a vaccine for them. You're taking the flu shot this year, and the flu virus is already advanced to the extent that the shot you're getting is not going to be effective. They know that.
Or they have to correct for the byproducts and the after effects of the vaccine itself.
Well, that's another problem. All right? It would be one thing if they said, it's like tetanus or smallpox vaccination. Smallpox vaccinations were known in the 1700s. We've had a tremendous amount of experience with smallpox vaccinations. We've had a tremendous amount of experience with tetanus vaccination. The reason I bring up tetanus is I had a tetanus shot not too long ago. You know what they did? I went into the doctor to get a tetanus shot because I cut myself fairly deeply. I hadn't had a tetanus shot in I don't know how many years, 15 years. And that's a deadly disease. So I went in, and the nurse comes out with the vial, and it says DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And I looked at it and I said, what is this? And said, well, that's a tetanus vaccine. And I said, well, no, it isn't. It's DPT. This is some children's vaccine. I just want a tetanus shot. And so, well, you can't get that anymore. You've got to take diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. Oh, thank you. What else am I getting? All right? So even in that area where we would say, oh, well, the tetanus vaccine has been around so long that we're probably fairly secure that we're not going to have our DNA altered by a tetanus shot. They're telling you that you can't get a tetanus shot. The technocrats know better than I do what should go into my body. I didn't come in to see that doctor saying I was suffering from diphtheria. He didn't find diphtheria. He didn't find pertussis. He didn't find anything except I had this wound, which might very well have led to lockjaw. But nonetheless, they said, well, too bad for you. This is what you have to have. And that's on the label. All right, that was on the label. What's in the vaccine that our friend Bill Gates has in mind? Got some DNA things that's going to change one's actual internal chemistry, some RNA particles that are going to do even worse to you. Who knows? You know, what people should do, they should read go to Robert F. Kennedy's Children's Health Defense site, and he'll give you a pretty good picture of what let's just say the unanswered questions are with this whole vaccine regime. But here you see another example of the technocracy coming forward. And this technocracy, here's this guy on the outside of government, Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, billions of dollars. And of course, the huge pharmaceutical companies that are allied with him and that are part of the concept of agency capture. The agencies are supposed to be, administrative agencies are supposed to be regulatory bodies. The theory is that they would make sure that the various industries or other areas of activity in society are operating in the public interest and not ripping us all off in one way or another. That's the theory. What actually happens is that those industries become complicit through open or more usually occult networks, and the agencies become actually agents of the regulated industries. And that couldn't be more obvious than in the area of the FDA. FDA has big pharma in its pocket.
And vice versa.
Just to say they work in a symbiotic relationship.
And there's a rotating or revolving door that tends to blur the lines between public and private sectors.
Oh, yeah, there's a great rotating door. That somebody comes into the agency, they spend a few years in the agency, and they go out and they're on the board of directors of Merck or something, whatever the company may be, Johnson & Johnson, who knows what company it is. And that's just simply understood, all right? You get all that knowledge, the government pays for you to get all this knowledge, then you go and work for the pharmaceutical companies, and then somebody from the pharmaceutical companies comes and they're appointed to this particular agency, and lo and behold, the decisions the agency makes are in favor of massive profits for the pharmaceutical companies. And the classic one is now this whole controversy over the hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, zinc treatment for COVID-19 patients, which has been proven if you catch it soon enough, it works. At least there are a heck of a lot of doctors who say it works, in the sense that we've given it to our patients and they got over the infection. It doesn't work when the patient's on the ventilator. 80% of them die anyway. But it works at a certain stage. And that combination of drugs, or at least the hydroxychloroquine and the zinc, they go back in the 1930s. Hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine.
Yeah, malaria medication.
Malaria, yeah, and people would buy them over the counter. You didn't have a prescription. You're going to some malaria-infested area, the doctor would tell you, well, if you have certain kinds of heart conditions or whatever, you don't want to take this, but all right, leave that aside. That's true of every drug, the counterindications. And you would take this before you went there for a certain length of time, I guess while you were there, and this would make you less susceptible to malaria. All right, so they knew about that. And they were doctors who were using this years and years ago. I read something just the other day that Fauci was aware that this drug had been used 15 years ago for treating coronavirus cases. So it's not something he didn't know about. It wasn't something that was just discovered yesterday morning. It was known. All right. So when he talks about anecdotal evidence, one has to wonder, does he understand the meaning of the word anecdotal? And another thing, of course, in being a lawyer, you go into court, criminal or civil litigation, it's all anecdotal. Court cases are not double-blind studies of different people that have done over 20 years.
In laboratory conditions, yeah.
You go into court for the very first time, and the evidence is presented for the very first time in front of this jury that was seated for the people, this particular group of people for the very first time, maybe the only time they'll ever be seated together in their entire lives, and a decision comes out. So we run a system of anecdotal law here, and we've been running it since probably the Middle Ages, derived from English law. So the idea that something might be anecdotal in the sense of this is how you run it, really doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. But there, he said that. There was an example of the hubris of these people. Instead of saying, well, there may be some treatments other than vaccination, other than ventilator, blah, 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 whatever they're proposing, they're using. And what we want to do is to allow the doctors, medically licensed and trained, with their informed consent of their patients, to use these medications as they think might be most effective under these conditions, because doctors often use medications for treatments that are not listed on the instruction sheet. That's well known. But no, they don't want that to happen. Now, why don't they want it to happen? Well, I guess because hydroxychloroquine is not patented anymore. It's a generic drug, and anybody can produce it. Azithromycin, I don't know whether azithromycin is patented, but I would imagine there's this Dr. Zelenko who was in New York. He's gotten a lot of play because he wrote a letter to the president.
Yeah, some 600 some odd patients effectively cured.
Yeah, up in some, I guess the Hasidic Jewish people, because just the name of the community sounds like that. But in any event, there he is. He's treating these people. He said, well, I treated something like 600 people with this, and I haven't had a problem. And he described it as hydroxychloroquine is there to assist the zinc to get into the cells, because the zinc that actually does the work on the virus. And the azithromycin is there to deal with any adventitious infections that may come up. It's antibacterial. And you need the three. And of the three, probably the most important is the zinc, because without the zinc, the other two are not going to be as effective, or maybe effective at all. So what did I see the other day, Virginia Department of Health? Because I looked this up and said, well, what's going on in Virginia with this combination of drugs? And they say, well, we're not in favor of this. We don't want this to be used. And they're talking about hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and they don't mention the zinc. Now, was that a typo? I mean, somebody just didn't, somehow or other they pressed the delete button when they got to the word zinc. Why is that there?
You know, they say that every lie has to have 80% truth, or at least in this case, 2/3 truth. They need to find some way to discredit the formula because it's effective, and since nobody holds a patent on it, there's no exclusive profits to Big Pharma.
Yeah, and also the example that was given, I think, in New York was, well, they would allow the treatment to be used on people who were what they call compassionate care, the people who had 2 feet over the edge of the grave and about to be rolled in. They were ready to die. They died in an hour. People on ventilators. And of course, that's not the point at which you give this drug. It has to be the people who have success with it say it has to be given early, right, before the damage has been done. So why are they saying that? Why do they say, well, we're going to just use it for compassionate care? Well, because they know it doesn't work then. So, I mean, you see these things and you wonder what the heck is going on with these people. And the answer is hubris, scientific hubris or scientistic hubris, right? Because real science does not operate that way. Real science is experimental. You try different things. You don't listen to orthodoxies and so forth and so on, else you get nowhere. But these people know the answers, supposedly, and they're going to jam those answers down your throat. And if you don't like that, well, then they're going to stop you from opening a hair salon or something, lock you up. And that happened, what was that, in Georgia or somewhere? The woman was sent to... I thought that was a fascinating one, too. Example of the hubris of the judiciary in this. That in that particular... It was Texas. In Texas, they had come up with some directive saying, we're going to let low-level prisoners out of the jails.
Right, while closing gun stores.
They'll all contract COVID-19. And then this judge says, well, I'm going to send this woman to jail for 7 days. I don't know why her lawyer didn't stand up and say, what, are you sentencing my client to death? What's the matter with you? Lawyer was very quiet. And I don't know why the governor didn't say that. Why the governor didn't say, what happened here? The judge, we've let these other people out because there's a danger, and this judge is putting this woman in there, and I'm taking her out. They have no gumption.
Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed so as to always stay up to date with our latest releases, including our continued conversation with Dr. Edwin Vieira. If you like what you've heard here, give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcatcher of your choosing. Likes and shares are the best way to help grow the community of enlightened warriors that are ready to stand for liberty and advance the security of a free state. Be sure to share the show with somebody you think would resonate with this message. You'll have my enduring gratitude for doing so. Remember, the path to mastery, like in all things, begins with a single step and then continued in sustained effort over time. So to master the foreign language that you've always wanted to gain fluency in and get a head start on your journey with a 2-week free trial, go to everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.